Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Avatar: The Last Airbender for both Timeless and Historic. So this is going to be the next set that drops on Arena, and it drops tomorrow, which is really exciting because I think this set potentially, mainly because of the bonus sheet, is going to shake up Timeless quite a lot. Historic, like I've said a few times, I'm not enjoying the format right now, which is partially why I've got back into Timeless, but I am definitely going to be trying these cards in Historic, and fingers crossed some of them can break through before we get some action taken against Eldrazi sometime down the line. But anyway, I'm going to start off by looking at the Timeless cards. And we're going to start off by looking at the bonus sheet. And for me, the most exciting card in Timeless is going to be Dark Depths, because this is a card that basically reintroduces both a new combo deck and also a new way that you can build mid-range decks as well. So if you're not familiar with this card, the two main ways that you try and kind of combo off with this card are getting it into play and then either using Vampire Hexmage to remove all the counters, which gives you the 2020 token, or you can also use Thespian Stage to copy it, and then the copy will enter play with no tokens, and then you get the same token again. So obviously, if you want to build kind of like a super streamlined version of the deck, you can obviously run both. Now, it is obviously awkward having to run multiple lands that don't produce black in a deck that also wants to run Vampire Hexmage, but typically, you know, most of the legacy decks that I've seen that run this sort of package tend to also run for Urborg to kind of get around that as well. And I also think crop rotation is going to be absolutely massive for this deck, whether you're playing the more all-in combo version or whether you're just putting, you know, Thespian Stage Dark Depths into like a Golgari mid-range deck with access to crop rotation and maybe Wary Zone Guard as well. So either way, I think this is going to be a really interesting card. Now, obviously, I think the big question mark over this sort of deck or idea is how well it's going to be able to play into Strip Mine. But there are a few ways around that, right? You can obviously potentially main deck Disruptor Flute as a way to shut that off, whilst also having applications in other matchups. You could potentially run your own Wary Zone Guard and stuff like that, but then you run into issues where you want to be running Ancient Tomb in the deck as well, and then it's really difficult to run Hexmage if you're running that many colorless lands. But there are multiple ways to build this, and I'm really excited to get my hands on it and try it out, and very happy this was pre-banned in Historic, because this would be an absolute nightmare to deal with. Then next up, we've got another card that's also pre-banned in Historic in Mystical Tutor, and this has been an interesting one because I think for me the main two applications for this are either in Reanimator, that I'll get to in a second because we're getting Entomb, but I'm most excited for this as a way to tutor Channel, which is, you know, obviously one of the very few cards that's been restricted in Timeless. So obviously, you know, the curve here is just have a lot of blue-green dual lands in your deck, turn one Mystical Tutor to put Channel on top, then turn two Channel, and then, you know, cast an Eldrazi or whatever. Obviously, that is incredibly vulnerable because if you're kind of draw locking yourself by putting the card on the top, and then if the opponent has a counterspell for this, right, Force of Negation is being added that we'll look at in a second, then that's obviously going to shut that off. So I think this may be a best of one deck if it is viable, but this is definitely an interesting interaction here. And then secondly, I do like it also in Reanimator, since we're getting Entomb as well, which I think is a really big addition, right? We have Entomb, we have Reanimate, we do have multiple 2-mana reanimation spells now. If you've got non-legendaries, you've got Persist. If you want to reanimate legendaries, you've obviously got Life Death as well. Now obviously running, you know, Reanimate and Life Death is gonna deal a lot of damage to yourself in terms of life total, but, you know, the fact we've got Entomb now means that you're going to be able to pull it off on turn 2 very, very consistently. And I think Mystical Tutor could be a nice way to just increase consistency overall in that deck. Helps find Entomb if you don't have, you know, a way to ditch a creature to the graveyard, and then helps find your Reanimate or, you know, Life Death or whatever to try and assemble that. Now again, this does make you more all in on the reanimation side of the deck, which obviously makes the deck even more weak to graveyard hate, so I'm not sure about that. And then obviously I have seen, you know, some talk about this in other decks as well. I don't really love this in Show and Tell, to be honest, though, because I think the important thing with Show and Tell is to have cards that are both good at finding the combo early on and also cards that help you combo off once you have Omniscience in play, and Mystical Tutor is really awkward with that because it puts it on top rather than into your hand, so I'm not sure it really fits there, and I'm not really sure you would want this in a fair deck, really, unless you really want access to specific sideboard cards. So for me, I don't know if this is going to see a ton of play in best of 3 because I feel like it makes the decks more one-dimensional in a way if you're just going for your Channels or your Entombs, but I do think it is nice if you're running a combo deck that needs instants or sorceries to go off outside of Show and Tell anyway, just increasing consistency. The next time we got Force of Negation, which is a card that I know a lot of people have wanted in Timeless for quite a while now, just as a way to kind of punish the Dark Ritual or Sacrifice decks, because Obviously, right now, there's nothing you can really do outside of, Subtlety and Commandeer, which not every deck can run, to stop decks that, have the turn 1 Dark Ritual or turn 1, Evoke Elemental into Sacrifice. So having this is going to be a really big deal. It's going to make running those Dark Ritual decks a lot more risky. Obviously, this is going to slot straight into the Dimir kind of tempo or control decks, but obviously if you're running a blue deck, you can potentially main deck this depending on the metagame, and it's obviously going to be an excellent sideboard card as well. So really like this to bring a bit more balance to the format, so there's fewer just turn 1 losses where you don't really have anything you can do about it. Then that's all the bonus sheet cards I want to talk about for Timeless. From the main set, I think the card I'm most excited for is Wan Shi Tong Librarian, which seems just like, a good threat to cast on turn 2 in a fetch land format, right? Whenever the opponent cracks a fetch land, you get to draw a card and grow the Wan Shi Tong. The fact it also grows means that it's not going to be vulnerable to Bowmasters as well, which is really nice. And then obviously as the game goes on, this is a really excellent mana sink, so I imagine this is going to be a slam dunk in the Dimir tempo decks. The fact it has flash means it's going to fit perfectly, and obviously you can hold your mana up for interaction and then flash this in if the opponent doesn't do anything. Obviously it being legendary is a drawback, so I'm not sure how many you would want to run, maybe 1 or 2, and it also fits inside Lurrus decks as well, which is a really big deal. So very excited for this one in kind of tempo and control decks. And then the last card I want to talk about in Timeless is Badgermole Cub here, because again, it's a fetch land format, so you can use Earthbend as kind of a ramp effect, right? If you use Earthbend on a fetch land and then crack it, not only do you get the land you fetch, but the fetch land also re-enters because of the Earthbend as well, which is quite nice. And then obviously there's other crossover synergies if you're running other mana dorks as well, which I don't think are particularly played in Timeless outside of stuff like Deathrite Shaman, but I think this is just kind of interesting as kind of a ramp card that does provide some extra utility depending on the rest of the deck as well. The next up we're going to be looking at the historic cards, again starting with the bonus sheet because I think that's where the majority of the most powerful cards are, and starting off with the card that I've personally wanted on the client for such a long time now in Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, because now this enables us to turn both effects that tutor lands onto the battlefield like Primeval Titan into a win condition, and just cards like Ice-Till Explorer into a win condition as well. I think, recently I've been brewing with Ice-Till plus Exploration quite a lot, and I think Exploration is going to be like a slam dunk in basically every Valakut deck. But, I was testing out Exploration plus Ice-Till Explorer plus Shifting Woodland to turn Ice-Till Explorer into kind of like a 1-card win condition on top of being a great value engine, but that required, much more deck building requirements to get going, whereas now we have Valakut, you can just run a Gruul deck with predominantly or almost all mountains and then Ice-Till Explorer, and then just turn that into a win condition. And then obviously the other two cards that work very well with Valakut are Scape Shift and Primeval Titan as well. Now obviously Scape Shift is kind of like a combo win once you have enough lands in play, or you have a Dryad of the Elysian Grave in play that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but I'm most excited for Primeval Titan because there's multiple ways that you can build Titan, and turn it into a win. Now we have Valakut. Obviously, the last time we could do that was when Field of the Dead was legal, but these two cards were never legal at the same time. So now we can actually use Primeval Titan as a win condition without relying on, convoluted loops with like spelunking and stuff like that. So in terms of Primeval Titan, in my opinion, I think there's two main ways to build around it. I think the first one that I'm really excited to try out is Creativity, because obviously Creativity is a deck that wants to be running almost all red lands anyway, so it makes, meeting Valakut's requirements pretty easy without needing to run Dryad of the Elysian Grave. And obviously if you're running Creativity, you can't run Dryad because you want to always hit Primeval Titan. And the really nice thing about, in my opinion, with Titan and Creativity is it makes the Titans very hard castable, right? I think one of the big issues with Creativity is obviously you have dead draws in your deck, especially, if you're running X equals 2 Creativity and you need to put stuff back. The fact that Primeval Titan can be hard castable if you're running a lot of treasure generators is really good and just increases the consistency, reduces your dead draws as well. And, is a pretty fast deck if you run Gruul, for example, which you obviously would want to because you're going to be running almost all mountains for Valakut, and you obviously need green to be able to hardcast the Primeval Titan. That then opens up cards like Wish Good Luck, which enables you to cast Creativity X equals 1 on turn 3 without any other setup. And then getting Primeval Titan online that early is really nice. And then obviously Titan being non-legendary also means X equals 2 or higher is going to be really nice. So that's a shell I'm going to be testing out early on for sure. And again, I think Exploration is going to be excellent there as well. And then secondly, I'm also excited to try it alongside Castle Garum Brig plus either Sunken Citadel or Eumidian Life Seed, which enables us to cast Primeval Titan way ahead of curve, including potentially on turn 2 if you have Exploration, right? If you go turn 1 Exploration, Sunken Citadel, turn 2 Castle Garenbrig plus another land. You can then just cast Primeval Titan on turn 2, which is incredibly strong. Now, obviously, the big downside of that is you're running a lot of non-mountains in the deck, but we have both Dryad of the Elysian Grove, and I probably should have brought it up as well, Leyline of the Guild Pact, I think is what it's called, a Leyline that we can put into play if we have it in our opening hand, that just turns all of our lands into mountains as well. Now, it is a little bit awkward, obviously, having to have either a Leyline or a Dryad in play for this to work, really, because, you know, if you don't have either of these, then it's going to take way longer for Primeval Titan to get Valakut online. But, you know, between for Dryad and potentially having a Leyline in your opening hand, it seems like it could be, you know, a potential viable strategy. And then obviously we now have crop rotation, which can help us get, you know, Sunken Citadel or Garenbrig, depending on whichever one we're missing. And then later in the game, we can obviously use crop rotation to get more Valakuts or more mountains to deal damage there. So very, very excited to try out Valakut and really hope this is good enough to at least be a tier 2 deck going forwards. Maybe even higher if Eldrazi does get hit. Then next up we got Standstill, which is a card I'm very excited for in both potential high noon decks and also potential control decks as well. So obviously Standstill is a card that you need to build around, right? The idea here is that you play this and then neither player really wants to trigger it. Although I guess on turn 2, if you have a 7, maybe the opponent is happy to just play into it if they have an instant, if you have to discard to hand size. But for the most part, this is a card that you want to put into play and basically just make the game slow down to a point. But obviously you need to be able to play through it, right? And I think we do have enough good tools where you can build around it, right? We've got Tamiyo, which can attack and then obviously create clue tokens, and you can just start cracking clue tokens if the opponent doesn't want to play into Standstill. We have Kaleem, which we can activate without triggering Standstill. We have Shark Typhoon, which is, I don't know, it's not really a historic power level card now. Obviously, it's a fine card. It is worse than Kaleem and Tamiyo, but again, if we just need a high enough density of cards for Standstill, I think it's definitely possible. And then obviously we've got lands like Murex as well. So, you know, if you do want to run Standstill, I think some of the best homes for it probably are going to be the High Noon deck, for example, where these also work well with High Noon, where you can use your Reprieves and Remands and then still, you know, do something else, even with a High Noon in play. Now, obviously, the big issue with High Noon is that it's terrible into Eldrazi, which is a big issue right now. So I don't know if that deck will be viable, but obviously, I hope that Eldrazi's days are numbered, and when we do get the next rebalances, they will go, and then, you know, High Noon with Standstill could potentially be a deck there. But looking at these cards that do work well with Standstill, you could also potentially build a control deck with it. Now, again, traditional control isn't really a deck because of Eldrazi, so again, I'm not really sure this card is going to see too much play right now, but I think it's a good sign from the last BNR announcement that they will hit Eldrazi, hopefully, next time. So then I'm definitely going to be trying out these Standstill decks. Definitely a card I'm excited to try out either way. Then next up, moving on to some of the main card sets. The main set cards. We've got Momo Friendly Flier, which is a really interesting card. Basically like kind of a one-mana ramp card if you're running a lot of creatures with flying. Now, obviously, there aren't really any archetypes that this can slot straight into. There aren't really many decks that have a lot of flies in, but I think the main way, or the best way to utilize this, is with the recent warp cards we got, like Quantum Riddler and Starfield Shepherd, especially Quantum Riddler. Seems like the most powerful out of these, because you can go Momo on turn 1, then the Quantum Riddler and Starfield Shepherd cost 1 mana to warp instead of the usual, and then with Riddler, for example, you can obviously go Warp Riddler and then either Ephemerate it or Consign it, and obviously, you know, getting to run main deck Consign is nice in the format, and having Quantum Riddler as a proactive way to use that seems nice, and this just increases the curve here. The awkward thing about Momo, though, is that it's legendary, so I'm not sure how many copies you want to run. It also kind of forces you into running Starfield Shepherd to have enough redundancy, but the nice thing about it is that you can tutor it off Starfield Shepherd, which can, you know, lead to some nice curve outs in the first few turns. Again, it feels like you're kind of building the deck around Momo to enable it, though, and obviously you can't really run 4 copies of Momo because it's legendary without it being awkward, really, or unless you have a way to discard them for value or whatever. So I'm not sure exactly how you build it. Maybe you run 1 or 2 of in a Warp Blink deck, for example. You know, maybe Esper would be the best way, because getting access to stuff like Juggernaut Peddler is really nice. But this seems like an interesting option. I think if you're running Starfield Shepherd, you should definitely be running, at the very least, one of this card as a choose target, but you could potentially run more if you want to build around it a little bit more. And then next up, we got Zhao the Moonslayer, which is a card I wanted to highlight because it does seem like an interesting hate bear. as just a way to slow down decks like Eldrazi, for example. The issue, though, is that it's not particularly aggressively slanted, right? Menace is nice aggressively, but I think you really do need to be running this in an aggressive deck. And if you're running this in an aggressive deck, I don't really know if it's better than, existing options like Cleansing Wildfire, especially because it's legendary. But again, if you're running just a pure aggro deck, getting this in play to just start applying pressure seems very nice. So yeah, maybe you consider this in the sideboard of a deck like Boros Energy. But again, then if you're running Boros Energy, I think White Orchid Phantom is better. If you're running, an Izzet deck, I think Consign to Memory is better. So I think there's a chance that it doesn't see play, but it's an interesting sideboard option, especially whilst Eldrazi is very popular right now. The next up we got Firebending Student, which again, I'm not super optimistic about this card, but I do think it's interesting because of the haste enablers that we have, specifically Swift Spear's teachings. Obviously, we do have Arena of Glory as well, but I think Arena of Glory is much more difficult to enable for 2-drops in Historic unless you're running mono red, because I've tried running, for example, Arena of Glory with Dreadhorde Arcanist, but that only works if you have Blood Crypt, really, because so many of the playable dual lands don't have the mountain subtype. It's really difficult for Arena of Glory to enter untapped. So I think this sort of thing is only going to be viable if you're running, a bunch of mountains and Arena of Glory, maybe like another red utility land as well, which isn't really a deck right now. But I thought it was interesting because if you can give this haste, this does seem pretty powerful, right? You give it haste, and then you immediately get the mana off it. If you have other mana available, like, you have 3 mountains and Arena of Glory, you can obviously haste this in, cast a couple of spells, and then attack. The issue, obviously, is that you only get the mana for the combat phase, so you'd have to be running a bunch of instants in order to benefit from this, which probably forces you to run buff spells or... I don't know if there's instant... I guess there is instant speed card draw in cards like Questing Beast and other exile effects like that. So you could potentially build around this. But again, I don't really feel like this is that much better, even if you do build around it, than existing options like Slickshot Show Off. So again, this is an interesting one to highlight, but I feel like you probably have to put too much effort into making this good for it to be better than cards like Slickshot Show Off, especially when it's not a wizard either. So you can't really slot it into the Izzet Wizards deck, which isn't even that popular right now because of the teachings nerf. But it's definitely a card I wanted to highlight because it is kind of interesting, especially if you're running more of a heroic deck with buff spells, for example. The next time we got Visions of Beyond, which, again, we're moving on to the more fringe cards here, and this is going to be an interesting card in mill decks, right? I still do see mill occasionally. I think mill isn't too bad into Eldrazi, but, against the rest of the format, it's really not great. But this is a buff to mill, right? It does give you good card advantage, so I will be trying out mill, but not super optimistic that this will make it anywhere close to a top tier deck in Historic, really. The next time we got Blasphemous Act, which is obviously just another option in terms of sweepers, but the fact it deals 13 damage to your own creatures can lead to some combos if you're running stuff like Screaming Nemesis, so I wanted to highlight it for that. The next time we got Bribery, which again, it's a very expensive card, but if you're running a green-blue X ramp deck and the opponent is playing like Reanimator or something, you can just use this as a way to cheat a big creature into play. Again, this is more of a fringe card. I really don't expect it to see that much play, really. Next, we've got Shattering Spree, which is another potential sideboard option against Affinity, whilst also being better in other matchups, right? Obviously, I think this is just not as good as Meltdown against Affinity, but the fact for 1 mana you can just destroy an artifact of any size does mean that this feels like a less narrow effect, right? If there are individual artifacts that you want to be able to destroy in other matchups, like if you're running an ETV deck and you want to answer for Torpor Orb, or you want to be able to take out talismans, or just more expensive artifacts in general, this seems like a better sideboard option than Meltdown. But if you are just hard targeting Affinity, I think Meltdown is the better card in that specific matchup. So definitely interesting sideboard card if you want to target artifact decks. And then next up, interestingly, we're getting a bunch of new lessons, which is cool. And now, unfortunately, well, I'll quickly go over some of the best ones here if I can remember them. Like, so we've got, some card selection. We've got a pretty flexible blue removal spell. We have, what other ones did I think were good? We've got a redirection spell for 1 mana, which is, I think, the most efficient version of this sort of card that we've seen, which can be good against certain effects. Then we have, counterspell. We have Price of Freedom is interesting especially whilst Eldrazi's in the format, a tutorable way to take out the lands there is nice. And also, if you do run a Cleansing Wildfire deck, this does provide redundancy. Now, the issue is that I think if you're building your deck around these sorts of effects, you would want to be running indestructible lands like Darksteel Citadel in order for Cleansing Wildfire to potentially ramp you against opponents who don't run utility lands that you want to be able to kill, or soul lands, for example. And so, considering Price of Freedom doesn't do that to your own lands, I'm not really sure you would want to main deck this many of that effect. So I'm not really sure this is going to have too many applications over Cleansing Wildfire, but it's an interesting addition. If learn cards... if we do get future learn cards in the Strixhaven set, then this is a potential option to run in your sideboard there as well. I think these are way more powerful than the current lessons we have. But like I said, the big issue is that the learn cards we have access to aren't that great. I think the best one is probably Eye Twitch, which is kind of interesting in like Mardu Sacrifice. Now that we have more options, obviously, you could run this alongside Goblin Bombardment as a way to just sacrifice it and trigger it quite easily. And then obviously, if you do look at those old Mardu Sacrifice decks, they also run stuff like Village Rites or Deadly Dispute as well, which obviously are great ways to sacrifice this. And then obviously you could consider it in decks like Yawgmoth as well. If you're running Birthing Ritual, this seems pretty interesting. So I think it does make Eye Twitch quite a bit better. So if you're running a sacrifice deck with consistent ways to sack this, consider running Eye Twitch over your Unlucky Witnesses and stuff like that. Although it does take up sideboard slots, which is a concern for sure. And then the other two learn cards that I have played in the past. First of all is First Day of Class, which can obviously be used alongside Putrid Goblin to allow you to combo. Again, I don't think that deck has really been viable outside of Best of One for a while, but it's definitely one that I'm going to be returning to now that we do get more utility off the learn on that as well. And then obviously we have Divide by Zero as well, which did see play back in the day when it was in Standard, but has never really been good enough in Historic. So again, it's notable that we're getting new lessons. I don't think either of these three cards are going to have a massive impact. Again, I think Eye Twitch could be worth considering, but losing sideboard slots when you could just run Unlucky Witness instead does seem like a drawback. So I think these probably won't have a big impact until we get more learn cards, but definitely worth bearing in mind, because of that. So those are all the cards I want to talk about. Like I said, I think it's mainly the bonus sheet that's going to have a big impact in Timeless and Historic. And again, I know I've said that I wasn't really going to play much Historic again, but I will definitely be trying these cards out. I'm not super optimistic that any of these will make Tier 1 decks in the current format, but, if we can create new Tier 2 decks now, when Eldrazi, or if Eldrazi does eventually get hit, then those will be a lot more interesting as well. And then obviously, the Timeless cards are very interesting to me. I'm really excited to try out Dark Depths because I've never played with it myself. It looks like a really fun deck to play. So I'm really excited for this release. Definitely going to be playing Timeless. Hopefully we can make some Historic decks that are at least Tier 2. I'd love if we can break into the Tier 1, but we'll see. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's any cards that you think I missed, especially from the main set. Because obviously there's a ton of cards in both Timeless and Historic that probably have cool interactions with cards that I didn't clock. So let me know in the comments if you think I missed any out. Also, if there's any applications of these cards that I didn't talk about, definitely let me know. Let me know what sort of decks you're planning to build as well. And then hopefully once the set comes out, I'll have some more deck guide videos in both Historic and Timeless. And I'm also considering potentially trying these out in Alchemy as well. If you're interested in Alchemy, definitely let me know in the comments. But either way, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.